Hey, everybody. Today we are going live in Facebook and live in the Anything for Love podcast. And I have not only my friend, not only my fellow, but she is Dr. Brashani Reece. And forgive me if you guys can hear the vacuuming that's happening outside of my door right now, but that's okay. We're going to continue on. Brashani is a prison reform activist, and she's also an advocate for restorative justice. And I shared just early, if you guys caught this, for those of you who in 12 step, I said she's not only my friend, she's also my fellow. I got full permission from Brashani to talk all things 12 step recovery today. So I'm not breaking her anonymity, but Brashani, welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
We are talking all about shame today. Shame. You know, I've been watching New Girl. Have you watched that show? It was on Fox, and there's a character, Winston, and he always goes, shame, shame, I know your name. And he starts dancing. And I was thinking, that's exactly what shame feels like, is somebody like mocking you and dancing at you. But when I asked you today, I always ask what everyone's intention is prior to the podcast. You had mentioned that shame came up for you, the topic of shame. Can you share more about how this resonates with you, and specifically to our audience who, you know, there's a couple different phases that people are going through. Some have just recently broken up and are not dating and are taking time just to focus on themselves. We've got people who are actively dating and it's going all sorts of great, but sometimes all sorts of wrong. And those that are in healthy and happy relationships and just want to maintain it. But how did shame, you know, the topic of shame, how did that come up for you?
Great question. For me, shame has been a huge part of my life, and I don't think I wanted to look at it. Specifically in our conversation, when I was thinking about what I want to say, it's that shame has prevented me from being authentic in my relationships, all relationships across the board. And this is in part because in every relationship, the flow of a relationship involves something along the lines of coming together, whoo, but then there's a break somewhere. Sometimes it's a tiny break, sometimes it's big, right? And then the intimacy in the relationship and whether or not the relationship is going to work is actually defined by how do we come back together and repair. And shame is a prevention from ever even addressing the break that has happened, and then really gets in the way of the coming back together. And so when we come back together, for me, shame has driven me to be a serious people pleaser. So there's a break that has happened. I'm feeling awful. Maybe I did something, or maybe the other person did something and I'm feeling harmed. In either instance, I just want it to be okay. So when we come back together, it's really just to come back together because I want to be like, please, it's okay, right? Like, we're okay. I'm okay. We're okay. We don't really need to talk about this, right? Like, we can just kind of be like, I'm good. You're good. Right. And then we move forward. But then the relationship doesn't last. And I wonder why then the next thing that happens, you know, could be very small or nothing at all happens and it just peters out. And the answer is, well, shame got in the way of the real relationship being formed. No accountability was taken for the harm that may have happened on either side or both sides or whatever. And then the relationship's over and I'm moving on to the next, 10 relationships that are in front of me and leaving those 10 relationships behind.
And never solving for what's really at the root, what's really underneath the shame. I know everyone defines shame differently. And I know I love when Brene Brown says that when she's sitting on a flight with somebody who's new and they're like, so what do you do for work? And she's really tired and doesn't feel like talking. She's like, I'm a shame researcher. Just gets quiet. So how would you define shame for those I think we've all experienced it, but shame and guilt are really different. So how do you feel like you would define shame as it relates to that of being trying to actively, fall back in love with ourselves, but also just show up in any relationship that we have?
There's a distinct difference between shame and guilt in that I think that guilt is an emotion for me that I experience when I have done something that was probably not great. And so my behavior, I do need to look at it and I do need to ask myself, do I want to do that again? Like that probably was not a really great thing to do. So guilt, a healthy amount of guilt can come in to remind me that I'm still in progress, that I'm growing, I'm evolving, I can do better. But shame is the like, try all you want. You will never do better.
Mm.
It's interesting to me you brought up the media reference because for me, Big Mouth, which is on Netflix, has the shame wizard. That's what it is, the shame wizard. And it's this guy that's like haunting. I mean, he presents as masculine anyway, like this haunting, sort of creepy, dark figure. And he's just having a field day going from character to character to character, pointing out all of the deepest, darkest things that you don't want anybody to know, and then reminding you that you are bad because of those things. So you didn't do bad, you are bad. And oh, once everyone knows, they'll see it. They'll see you for what you really are. And that's what shame is, I think.
Well, I think that's a great explanation. And I feel like too, that I feel like I'm always going to see shame as like that haunting character now that you just brought it up. But it makes me think to my own experience when I first learned that I had a love addiction, and that the way that it manifested for me was that I was compulsively trying to pursue one relationship after another, in the hopes that it would make me feel good enough that I would be rescued or adored, right? I hear that a lot from clients. They're like, I just want someone to adore me. And I'm like, I get that, but I think now that I'm on the other side of it and really starting to heal that part of wanting to be adored, what came up for me when I first got into recovery was the shame. All of the things that I had said, all of the things that I had done to be able to get, in my case, it was male attention, but it was also actually attention from my friends and family. So it showed up, like you were saying, the people pleasing, it showed up in like so many aspects. And, for some, for some who may have gotten pregnant and not decided to keep the baby, for others who may have contracted an STD, or others who have, I remember just sleeping with person after person and just thinking like, oh, if I sleep with them, then that will make me fall, that'll make them fall in love with me. It's ultimately what was my demise, was what I realized, like, oh my gosh, I really am actively trying to find the one, and yet I'm falling farther away from myself. And I know you've been really outspoken on your Instagram, and we even had a conversation before talking about how deep do we want to go in terms of fellowship and having this conversation. But how did shame show up for you prior to getting support in 12-step recovery? And then now, as you're starting to heal, how does shame show up a little bit differently? Because I know it still shows up for me.
Oh,
But I
yeah.
have like a greater awareness now that I'm a little like, I'll just like cry my eyes out for a day. But it doesn't last, like, I don't take everybody down with me while I'm doing it.
Yeah. When I started doing recovery work, I was able to really go back to the moment in which I actually split into, psychologically speaking. So for me, I was very young and I was caught. I say caught because we all do this, or many of us have this experience, but I was very young and engaging in sexual play with a friend, and I was caught in the act of this. And in that moment, I know, right? How could I? And people, so people, it's funny because, sort of side note, people will say like, I can't believe that kid was touching themselves or doing this or that. And they'll act as if they must have been sexually abused or they learned it from an adult or whatever. But you learn in psychology classes, actually, like especially at the graduate school level, how normal like masturbation and sexual play and exploration really is among like 4, 5, 6-year-olds. Like that's just like a normal part of what they do. But how adults respond to it set us up for then how we feel about that in ourselves. So for me, yeah.
I'm going to pause you for a second because the internet cut out, and I'm concerned that all the most beautiful parts that you just shared, which are actually quite shaming words, might have got lost in the recording. So I just want to make sure that you say it one more time. You said that it's really common that at young ages, 5 years old and plus, that kids masturbate, and what were the other, sexual play? What were the other things?
Engage, yeah, in sexual play with each other. Bodily exploration, both solo and with other kids. Because, a 3-4-year-old, whatever, when they're in the tub and they're feeling the water and it feels so good and whatever, there is that sort of like, oh, this feels really good. And they continue on with that sexual play and exploration in those young ages, 3, 4, 5. It's typical, but it's how adults respond to witnessing that or encountering that,
Yes.
that then sets us up to feel a certain way about the sexual emotions and experiences that are happening for us.
Brashani, like if we get nothing else out of this episode, like I've heard that before from my sponsor, who's a counselor and has got her master's, but my God, like it really is the parents or the adults' reaction to the normal and common behavior of exploration, be it, like you said, solo or with other kids, that makes us feel shamed. Like my mom used to call it the funny feeling. She is like, when you get the funny feeling, you just gotta get out. You gotta go, we're gonna go horseback riding. You get outside. Everybody would be like, just get outside. And I'm like, so it actually taught me as a young adult that whenever I have this feeling, this funny feeling, which is just, a heightened sense of, whether I'm ovulating or horny, whatever you want to call it, like to distract, to just do something different, as opposed to just really tapping into my own body and my own sensations. So please continue. But like, I think what happens is you're setting the stage up for people to understand that if the adults in our lives, the caregivers in our lives, were to have just responded with an open and loving and, oh my gosh, this is so normal, like, as opposed to like, let's not even address it or let's shame them for it, it would actually allow us to show up as young adults and as an adult in a totally different way.
Yes.
Because we always would have felt good enough. Podcast over. That was amazing. No.
Well, and in your instance, I would go so far as to suggest that your mom literally told you take that elsewhere.
Yeah.
Funny feeling. Take it elsewhere. You gotta go.
So true.
And so in my situation, unfortunately, my mom was called, because I was at my friend's house, and my mom was called. And so then my mom came to pick me up. Now I can't be with my friend anymore because that was, oh my God, whatever we just did. Right. And my mom was very distressed because my father his physical discipline was at times, I would say, abusive. And she would try to protect me and my brother from my father's physical violent outbursts. And so I remember her being very, very distressed. And how could I, and why did I do that? And then she said, we have to keep this a secret from your father because we don't know how he's going to react. And I'm 6. And I have been spanked and hit and whatever at this point by my father. And so in my mind, she was basically saying, this is now a secret, or else you will suffer violence.
Wow.
So now we have the split.
Okay, wait, I think we split at the same age. Mine was 5, but yeah, like splitting at the same age, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because now there's this ability to say, because it all comes back to our deepest fears, right? Around shame it goes back to what you said earlier, like, I am inherently bad. I am not good. And that's why I think we often use the expression, like, I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which I totally want to get into. I feel like I keep saying that today. So clearly that must be a theme. Wow, Brashani. Okay, so keep going. So what happens after this? What happened for you after the split?
I would say that the split just continued over time, and there have been periods of my life where the split accelerated. So it continued over time, but I did, when I moved into adolescence, I did date, and I had a high school boyfriend, and I sort of went about that. But then came my first instance of cheating. now I have another split happening, because now it's like, not only is my sexuality and my sexual desire a thing that is split off from so I have my good girl and my bad girl, but now I have even badder girl, and going into that territory of like, I'm going to play a man's game and I'm going to keep this part of me secret, and it holds power, and I have power over others, and I get to be disconnected from my boyfriend and not totally attached to him, because now I'm learning that I can have my own double life happening. So I have like a double life happening.
That was my split too. It was my freshman year of college. I made out, like aggressively made out. We were like hooked up. And I remember cheating on my boyfriend at that time. I got caught by a psychic. Did I ever tell you this story?
No.
He worked with a psychic, and that psychic said she didn't tell him she had these abilities, but she's like, I think your girl's cheating on you. He brought it up to me, and I was like, what? And I vividly described it, and I was like, I literally crumbled like on the phone. I was like, I can't lie about this anymore. But you said something that I want to go back to that I really feel like was a defining moment for me. So I'm wondering if it's showing up in the same way for you, which is, you said it's a man's game or something. You said something like it's not a man's world, but like a man's game. Was that the word used?
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that more? Because what I used it as was, I can have sex like a man. Like, I don't have to, like you said, like, I don't have to get attached. I don't have to get too close to you. I can live this life where I am still inherently good, and I'm with like anytime I was with my Nana, like that's who I was, like that's who I am at the core, like thoughtful, kind, considerate. But then like there was this other part that was like almost domineering, like you said, like it was like this powerful, I'm in control, no one's gonna hurt me, but yet deeply hurt when the relationship didn't go the way that I wanted it to, but pretended like everything was fine. How did it show up for you? Did it show up similarly or different?
Oh, no, I mean, you're right on track, right? Because when we layer in recovery from sex and love addiction specifically, at that same age where I split and I learned sexuality bad. So sexual Brashani bad, Brashani in school and being in the world like good or whatever. But I was immersed in a household where my father is a pornography addict. So I'm surrounded by sex, but now I have to pretend like it's not there because this is bad. And all of the messages that were being layered on about what it meant to be a woman in the world, because my father objectified them and upheld their physical appearance as like the most important thing. And so when I'm witnessing, my mother being in relationship with a pornography addict and being accepting of that. And I remember as a young woman being like, I will never be with a man who is like that, but I became like that. And I started to interpret it. Yeah. I started to interpret it that it was power, that it's power to be aloof. It's power to objectify. It's power to be able to use my sexuality to obtain as many men as possible. And when men would be hurt by it, I would just say like, well, I'm just doing what you all do anyway. And even if you say that you don't do it, I know you do. Which is rooted in my father basically being like, listen, the truth of the matter is like one woman is not enough for any man. And that was something that he would say. And so I wanted to be like, oh yeah, well, guess what? One man is not enough for this hot stuff. but all of that is a cover, right? All of that is a cover. Because
it's the sphere of intimacy that we talk about. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but no,
but it's a cover too, because at that very like split, like I'm bad and I can't talk about all of these things that are happening. And if I have feelings about all of it, like that's that part of me. And so we can't have this conversation. So I'm just bad. I'm bad that I want to masturbate. I'm bad that I want to be sexual. I'm bad. And I'm bad because look at like men who objectify women and I'm heterosexual. So I want to be with these men. Like, talk about like confused. But deeply ashamed,
Confused and deeply ashamed. Because as you were talking about that, what was coming up was two things. One, none of my girlfriends in junior high, high school, college, no one spoke about masturbation. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s where one of the girls was like, oh, so I was watching porn in my new bathtub and like we were all in the bathroom. And she's like, look at the TV, it's awesome, it's perfect. And she starts describing like, oh, when I'm in the bathtub, I do this and that. And I'm like, my mouth dropped. And then the second time I heard the word masturbation was in 2015 or 16 in a Sunday night's women's meeting for SLAA. And I was like, people talk about this? Like, I thought this was a shameful thing. The other thing that was coming up as you were talking was how men objectified women, and how I received when I would get a compliment. Like, I remember this guy I dated, his brother like made a comment about my butt or something, and I remember feeling elated. Like, I remember feeling like I was standing up a little bit taller, and I was like, I'm a dancer, I don't know, it just is what it is. But I felt good enough. And then I found myself fantasizing about the brother or whatever, and it became this like double entendre of like, I'm confused, but I'm ashamed. I'm confused, but I'm ashamed, but then I feel good. And that's why I think it can be, and I know we'll probably get into this, but it can be very confusing when you first start a new relationship and all you've ever seen on TV or in the movies is that of, it should be electrifying. It should be a magnet. You should be ripping each other's clothes off, and that should continue all the way through. And that does happen at the beginning. But if we aren't careful of those shame conversations and having conversation about where we don't feel good enough, it can break off really quickly. And I know I'm getting a little ahead, but yeah, just any reflections, I welcome them.
Yeah, I would say that I think in response to what you're saying about getting the comment about your butt, right? It's like, yeah, I would always feel elated, but just like any other dopamine hit, it doesn't last and it requires more and more and more. And at the end of the day, it's actually hollow, because what it reminded me of was that in that moment, I'm being valued for whatever attractiveness somebody perceives of me. But I had a professor once who teaches about grief and death and law, and she specialized in the psychology around grief. And she was saying that one of the hardest things to come to grasp with is that everything that we value about ourselves will be taken from us as we age. Everything. And so I don't mean everything we value in the world, like you can build up money and wealth and career success and accolades and whatever. But if you value your mind, cognitive impairment happens over age. If you value your appearance, you change, so, and so even when a man is saying to me that I'm so attractive and whatever, if it's a superficial compliment that he's giving me and he's not talking about something that's like a part of my spirit or my energy in conjunction with that physical part of me, all it really did was remind me that that's going to pass and that's not always going to stay the same. And someone else is also going to catch that guy's eye. Because if you're looking at me like that, that means you're also looking over there like that, which is what my dad would do.
Yes. And
so I can't actually hold you. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it was essentially what I would do when I was objectifying people. It was just based on the physical, not the emotional.
Right. And, there is a way to physically like appreciate and be like, oh, wow, you're so, and that can be true. But to me, if it is just superficial, then once again, I'm not good enough, because the thing that you're seeing about me is the thing that is not actually really about me. It's more about your projection or your perception of me in this moment. So you will leave me. You will abandon me. This is not real. And so, which somehow I then take on to myself and think again, like I haven't done enough to prove to you that I'm valuable, to show you that I'm valuable. So it was always a double-edged sword, and usually an indicator for me that I needed to get as far away as possible from this relationship, i.e. go cheat. So if I'm in a romantic relationship and this guy has just objectified me, I'm gonna go elsewhere, but I'm not gonna tell him, right? Because then that would be honest and authentic and dangerous, and I'd have to confront some things.
and it would also, if we live off of shame and the shame spiral, it's not feeding that addiction. It's not feeding that compulsion. So it's like, well, if I tell this person, then I'm not going to feel shame. I mean, I would probably feel guilty. I remember feeling guilty, but But and part of me felt shame actually, now that I say it, but it was mostly like, and I think that was the last time I cheated because the shame was so severe. But shame showed up in so many different aspects, because then it was even like trying to pursue somebody else who was taken by another. That was something else that was really up for me. And it's definitely something that, I remember my cousin said to me, she was like, I've seen you in action. Like, I've seen you flirt with, be yourself with men who are not, who are married and off limits. She's like, you're you, 100%, laughing, joking, cracking jokes. I did notice I was kind of sexual, like a little, like would tell a sexual joke. And, but then the guy who I was really into, who I was super attracted to, who I really wanted to have a relationship with, I would clam up because I would be awkward, and I would always pick the guy. I remember being at a wedding, it was an engagement party. There were two guys in front of me. One was a shit show and the other one I really liked. And the shit show ended up having a girlfriend, which I didn't realize at the time. And my friend at the time, Rachel, she said, you will always go for the guy. I mean, you have this guy, Zach, is standing in front of you and he is incredible. And you are like, and I go, Rachel, I am so afraid that if he knows that I like him, he will reject me. And that was like the shame cycle that just kept going. And it was one of those things that I eventually I felt I needed to conquer and accomplish and have him know that I was interested, but then also the other, and then just playing it. And it was like, what am I doing? And that caused more shame.
Oh yeah, I so get that. The guys that were actually in my league, quote unquote, I was always playing on the leagues below, because if I actually told the guy that was, really well put together, attractive and really had a lot going on for him, there was no way. I knew I couldn't sustain a relationship like that, because I would just feel like crap all of the time. Like he's going to discover who I really am at any moment. And I just wouldn't even try. It was so funny because I would just be so casual with him, because I'm just like, he's off limits. And I was like, why is he off limits? It's like, well, because I got to get these, like, these guys down here to all want me and fight over me. Like, it's
totally. Like, well, and I think as you were talking about that, what brought up for me was career, and how I also was choosing jobs that were below my standard or below my experience, and feeling bad that I had passions and pursuits outside of the career that I was actually in, because I felt that if I was to speak up for what I really wanted, or go pursue that career, or ask for that promotion or that raise or whatever the case may be, that the shame would keep me stifled and I would lose my voice. And it's one of the most powerful tools that I teach my clients, is how to use your voice in a way that feels really authentic to you, because you trust yourself implicitly. And that takes time. You can't just like come in hot the first day and be like, all right, I'm ready to trust myself. Like, there's the willingness, but there's also the ability to say like, well, what's underneath all that? And I know with the time we have left, I want to talk about how this ability to recognize your voice when it came to love and relationships, and removing and discovering the shame that was embedded in there, and then going on to get into recovery and having healthy relationships, is when I met you guys. For those of you who don't know, I met Brashani in recovery. However, Brashani came at the first Summit of Love. So for those of you who don't know, Summit of Love is an annual event that I do in November that brings all these women together to talk about living a life that we love. And you could go even deeper than that and talking about our love for ourselves and learning how to trust ourselves. And so Brashani was having a moment downstairs, and I was trying to catch my breath in between talking, and we bumped into each other. And we decided that she was going to be my first business coaching client. And I don't advertise business coaching clients. I don't advertise business coaching. And it's because I hand select who I want to help them pursue their passion. And so during that conversation, Brashani and I met in Whole Foods, remember, in the South End. And she had and I would love for her to share this with you, a really deep dive as to what truly she felt called to talk about in her career. And I wonder, Brashani, can you help us bridge the gap from, the moments that you've had in recovery of discovering shame, how that showed up in your relationship, but then how that showed up in your career, and how that helping people to understand like how you use your voice in the way that you do around prison reform and what that means, because some people may not understand what that means actually.
Yeah. Wow. Let's see if we can do this.
Yeah.
First, the easy question. So prison reform is the general idea that we need to address the mass incarceration problem that we have in our country. So for those of you who don't know, you might have heard, because it is becoming more common knowledge, the United States locks up people in prison and jails at a rate much higher than any other country in the world. So that's like the basic statistic to know that, that's something that we do, incarceration. And that's because our criminal justice system is broken. And in kind of bridging that really quickly into our topic today, that's because our criminal justice system is not about accountability or repairing harms or centering survivors and facilitating healing. Our criminal justice system is about, this person did a harm. It's against the state, not against people. And since it's against the state, we're now going to charge you with a crime. And then our form of justice is literally watching the clock. So we put somebody in a cage, and then we say, this cage is going to last 10 years for you, 15 years. And in our country, and what ties into my passion, is that we actually say, oh, the thing that you did, the harm that you did, is going to basically, the time is never going to run out. You are going to die in that cage, because that's justice. But there is no healing facilitated, no accountability facilitated. So we're literally expecting then survivors to heal because that person's rotting in a cage.
And
So
let me pause you there for a second. Brashani used to work in the prisons, so she's speaking from an educated perspective, not from a perspective of assuming that people don't get healing in prison. She's speaking from direct experience. Yeah.
Right. And so even though I was never, because just to clarify, I was never employed in the prisons, but my background is in forensic psychology. And as a restorative justice practitioner, I was in the prisons working closely with people who had committed harm and survivors of harm to do the very thing that we don't do in our system, which is to try to find some healing and accountability. What does that process look like? And so that's, incarceration is what's happening. But when we were doing restorative justice work, we were trying to do something different than what the criminal justice system does. And so how that ties in. So then the bigger question of like, how does that tie into my own experiences of accountability and shame and being in recovery and all of that? As I went through learning restorative justice and working with incarcerated people, what I figured out was that I am more likely to relate to a person who is doing time for something very harmful that they have done. I'm more likely to see myself in them than I am to see myself in survivors, interestingly enough, even though I am also a survivor of violence. But the exile that those individuals experience from our communities, from their families, and from themselves by going through the criminal justice system, the exile is so real for me that I identify as a perpetrator in many ways, because I can reflect back over the things I have done in my life that has created harm, but probably most importantly, the shame that came up from those things that I buried or attempted to disassociate from through my addiction, and the lack of meaningful opportunities to take meaningful accountability in relationships to the people that I actually cared about, but I hurt. So does that bridge it sort of?
Yeah, it does. My mind was trying to go to like 5 different things, which is why I paused, because I was like, I could go any direction. But I think with the time that we have left to Brashani, I just wanted to ask you, what do you want to what's something that you can leave us with that you feel like, is there anything else that you want to say about shame, about the work, the beautiful work that you're doing in the world, not only in terms of recovery and sharing the message, but also the beautiful work that you're doing within prison reform. Is there anything else that you just feels on your heart that you want to share?
I think what comes to mind is that what we do in our society is we look away, or we move away from conflict, from harm that has been done. We move away from it in all of our relationships. We don't want to, including with ourselves. We don't want to look in the mirror, and we don't want to have conversations with those that we love. Those are the types of things, though, that have taken us so far away from our humanity and from recovery and from healing and all of that. And so even though my work and my life's mission is really with people who are, sentenced to life without parole in our prison system, and talking about forgiveness of horrific crimes, right? But when you bring that down onto the micro level, it's that I needed to start my own journey of self-forgiveness and making my amends to people that it's safe to make amends with, while also moving forward in my relationships in a way that leans in to the conflict, leans into the intimacy, rather than turns outward from it.
It's really powerful. It has been an honor to have you on here.
Thanks, Katie.
And I just want to share, for those of you who are watching live on Facebook, and for those of you who are listening to the podcast when it comes out in a couple weeks, please comment and please be sure to tag Brashani and I. Brashani, where can people find you to help understand? Maybe they're feeling called to talk more about recovery. Maybe they're feeling called to talk about prison reform and those who are in jail for lifetime sentences and needing support from either family members. Tell us what are the ways that we can get in touch with you?
Pretty simple. My name is very unique. So you would either find me most likely on Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah, it's Brashani, you guys, and Reece, Reece. And thank you. And so, as I was going to say, tag us, make comments. If there's something that you want more information on, I'm either happy to put you in touch with Brashani, or we'll have her back on the podcast to have a deeper conversation. Today was really powerful to talk about shame. And thank you for talking about things that are shameful to most people, but that we are reducing the stigma around it. And that's really my intention on the Anything for Love podcast. And it's just to have conversations that sometimes make us go, oh, she just said the word masturbation. Shit. She just said life without parole. Let's talk about this shit, because we're all deeply affected by it, and we don't need to be anymore. We can reduce the shame. So thank you, Brashani. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie.